Hi, and welcome to the Research Room, a space to make research by the people for the people.
Perfect synergy.
And today I'm going to be doing another episode of Falsifiable Fridays. And I will be wrapping up empathy for this month at least. And I mean, we've learned a fair amount of what empathy is all about at this point. I want to focus on how to increase it. Even though, of course, it has its ups and downs, and it's not to say that empathy is great for every single situation. I think it's still a useful skill, um, and I think it's something that potentially is lacking. I mean, there's definitely studies that have come out that have said that empathy has been decreasing over time, and whether or not that is the actual like truth, or if there's other like nuances to that doesn't matter. Empathy is still something that is, I think, vital for like human survival. So, with that being said, I I'm not going to focus on how to increase empathy per se in this episode. I do that in some of my other content, and actually in my blog post tomorrow. I'm going to go through a full example of how to do that and what to expect if you were to be a part of this intervention that I'm going to be talking about today. Um, I am mostly going to focus on like what questions I had, what concerns I might have had while reading the research paper for this week. Um, and okay, so I'll go through a few of the not a few, I mean all the components of the intervention, um, and I'll just do that kind of briefly so that you know like what I'm generally talking about. And then I'll go ahead and move on to my concerns. So, um, everything that I'm about to say is it's definitely it's like sort of a new-ish idea, and what I mean by that is the researchers really want to use smartphones, whether this is through an app or just like through the smartphone in some other kind of way. Um, to utilize those functions and to utilize just like the everyday kind of nature of our smartphone use, that we have it near us, that we're going to be on it at some point, might as well like use that to do this kind of intervention. And so um, I think they even say like the idea that I mean, smartphones kind of take us away from empathizing, from human connection, things like that. But so like let's actually use this to do the opposite and to reconnect us. Cool. So basically, you get some prompts on your phone. These prompts will like signal like, hey, like do this for empathy, do that for empathy. Try to train your own empathic skills. I think that's fine, but like I am kind of curious about like, do you think that would work? And do you think that like this kind of approach is what we should be moving toward? Would you think that is annoying if you're like having to do this on your phone? Do you think that there's something lost just by doing this over the phone versus like having that like actual human component? I'm curious about what you think, but that's what these researchers did, and so that's what I'm going to talk about today. There are four main things that go on with this intervention. They're just trying to increase some skills that you could use for empathy. So the first one is all about perspective taking. When it comes to perspective taking, that just means that like, can you understand what the other person is going through? Can you understand their thoughts, their actual feelings, and things of that kind of nature? And so they will use stories and things like that to have you like try to take that another person's perspective and just kind of like get used to that idea. They also talk about empathic concern, and so this is something I also talked about last week, actually, this idea of actual like deep concern for somebody else, wanting to help them in some kind of way, like that kind of like compassion sort of thing. When you have that concern, you want to be able to do something about it. And so, and because you understand what they're going through, right? That's the like empathic part of this. And so, for this, actually, what they want to do is they want to increase self awareness, and through self awareness, you actually start to have more concern for other people. When you are aware of the other things that you're going through, you can start to think like, oh, like I'm going through all these things. This is how I'm feeling. Maybe some other people are feeling like this. Maybe even everyone is feeling like this, and I can like actually bridge that gap that was initially between us. So, yeah, with more self-awareness, you're going to be more concerned about others and wanting to understand their situation and actually help them. Then there is the idea of empathic accuracy. And so with this, this is actually something that you can find online already. There are like interactive games that you could do if you are curious about like your own empathic accuracy. This is on a site called greatergood.berkeley.edu. And what is happening there is just the idea that you will see pictures and you'll try to understand what is this person feeling, and then you actually get feedback like, hey, you were right, hey, you were wrong. And after that, they also show like why you were right or wrong. They show like on the faces like different things that might indicate different emotions. Maybe it's something about your eyebrows, maybe it's something about like the way that your mouth is sitting, things like that. And then the last one is enacting empathy itself. So it's great that you have all these skills, but what do you do about it? Like after you know that you are concerned, after you know what the other person is feeling, will you actually do something about it? And so this last point is to actually engage in that behavior to actually like help somebody. And so all it asks you to do is first take somebody else's perspective and then try to figure out, what can I do? What can I actually do? So make a list of things that I can do for this person. It doesn't have to be anything like spectacular, right? Like it could simply just be like, I'll listen to this person a little bit more. I'll maybe validate what they're saying a little bit more, things like that. And so you make this list, and then they'll also ask in a couple of days after you've made that list, actually do something from that list. Just do at least one thing. And then you get that practice, right? It's not just empathy, but there's a follow-up to it. Cool. So that is the gist of the intervention. I mean, maybe even have opinions and thoughts on that already. But what I'll say now, I'll move on to my concerns about this. And so just some things that I want to like think about in thinking about like, is this intervention gonna actually work? Are people going to do this? And that's the biggest question, I think. So I think also with a lot of this is like, there's so much guesswork that is happening right now, which is, I think, kind of fine. Like as long as it works, great. But we don't really know what, how much of this you need, right? So this whole idea of when you have an intervention, you should know to some degree at least, like how often you should do it, for how long you should do it, things like that, to actually make a change, not just in the short term, but also in the long term, hopefully. And so there are no answers. There's no answers that are supported by science that I know of, at least. And so when you think about like perspective taking, let's say, how many times do you need to do it in order to actually like ingrain that skill in yourself? And like, that's also probably going to depend on the person, right? Like there might be some sort of average out there, but like maybe for one person, maybe it takes one time and like you've got it and like you just kind of do it. Maybe for somebody else, it takes like 20 times. And maybe you can even think of someone in your own life that it does take 20 times, at least 20 times. And that's also okay, right? Like as long as they are willing to make that change, if they're willing to try to understand themselves and understand others as well, I think that's all perfectly okay. But like if we're actually trying to like help people here and help people by increasing their empathy, then we should probably figure that out. And it shouldn't just be completely guesswork. So yeah, there's that kind of idea of like how many of these you need to do. Maybe you already like are very good at one of these. Maybe you're already very good at perspective taking, and like you just kind of lack that concern kind of aspect. So you can understand what people are going through, but like you're not fully like caring about what's happening here. And also like kind of what I said last week is like, I mean, that concern piece is pretty critical, because if you are just understanding what somebody else is going through, that doesn't make you want to be like warm and caring toward them. not by itself at least. If you have that other piece to you, then you're more likely to help. And so yeah, I guess the point is just like within this intervention, is there like room to like focus more on one skill versus another? And I would say probably not, like if it's a pretty like blanket sort of intervention, and it's just like kind of made into an app. But like potentially there's room to be able to like say like, hey, like I'm actually good at this, and I want more practice on these other things. Maybe it doesn't have to be the whole like intervention, which might last like a whole like 3 weeks or something. Maybe you just really need 1 week of like intensive like skill training on one of the facets here. So that's the first thing that I had. We don't know is the thing. The second thing, though, is even if we did know, even if we knew every single thing about like how many times it took, that doesn't mean it's going to work. And so what I mean by that is there's still components of the individual that is going to partake in the intervention that we have to consider. And there are going to be certain people that like are going to be like resistant to this kind of thing, right? And like that's okay, right? Like empathy, as we've learned, it's effortful, it takes energy and things like that. And some people really just don't want to do that, and that's okay. Not every single person has to be empathic. I hope most people have it to some degree, and if they, even if they don't necessarily like do it all the time, at least like they can do it if they want to. It should be a skill that like you are allowed to use whenever you want. But the thing is, if you are not motivated to learn about empathy, to improve it within yourself, I feel like it's going to be a lot harder for any of these things to work. Like maybe they go through the motions, but like they don't actually internalize any of these lessons. And so I think that's like one of the major factors that like people need to look into is like, do people actually want to improve their empathy? And then also like, are they willing to like put in the work? So there's those kinds of things. There's also like just other personality characteristics that, I mean, research has shown tends to relate negatively to these kinds of ideas. So, right, so like if you are higher in something called the dark triad of personality traits, so this could mean that you are like overly cynical or like overly controlling, if you are antisocial, if you are very narcissistic. Like, I don't mean these like in a very like casual, like kind of like, I'm just not just throwing these kind of terms out. I mean, like if you are really like high on these things, then you can imagine how empathy, like it might not really just sit with you. And I think I kind of want to like further explain that actually, is that people that might be very high on these traits, if they are empathic, and I think it's very possible that they can be, right, in a very like skillful technical sort of way, right? Humans are able to understand other humans, and what they do with that information is going to be very different from person to person. So someone who is very antisocial or very narcissistic, let's say, they might empathize with somebody, and like other research also supports this, that like, yes, people are very capable of empathizing even if they are high on these dark triad kind of traits. If they are going to empathize, they might use that against somebody. And I mean, we even kind of see that for people who aren't high in these kind of traits. Like if you just don't have concern, like you already might like whether it's consciously or not, like you might just kind of manipulate that information, or at least be cold and callous about somebody who's going through that. And so I do want to say that like we have to consider these kinds of things, and like, do we actually want to like teach empathy to all people and like in the same kind of way? Like, is there something else that we could be doing for these other people to like maybe help get rid of some of that like the narcissistic tendencies, and not just use empathy for like a greater evil sort of thing. And none of this is to say that like people that have these traits, like anything is kind of good to some degree. And yeah, it just kind of depends on what you end up doing with those traits. There's nothing inherently evil about people that have that are high on certain traits. But we should be cautious about like the ways in which we might be like using empathy. So that is another concern of mine. Then I have two more fairly quick ones, I think. Um, we have to think about what are the consequences. Also, so I've kind of talked a little bit about the consequences like interpersonally. What about just like within yourself? If you are constantly try to empathize, if you are actively working on these skills, we already know that empathy takes energy. I mean, much like anything, right? Like any thought that you have, any behavior that you have, any emotional thing that you might have, right? That's going to take some energy. And so if we are trying to train people, it might be good to just like be cognizant that like, hey, this is also going to take some time and work and energy. And are people going to be okay with that? That's also part of it. It's not just like this free skill. Like, I mean, there's payment in the sense of you have to put in that investment. And so um, I think my real concern here is that people might burn out. And I mean, honestly, like, I mean, hopefully people don't burn out after just like a quick intervention. And again, like if this is just 3 weeks, let's say, hopefully people are not burning out by then. But like also maybe it's a new skill and like you just want to keep like doing it over and over and over again, and you do burn out, right? Like maybe there's nothing like inherently about the app or the intervention itself that causes burnout. But people, I mean, people do what they want to do. People will do things after they've learned them. It's a new skill. They're excited to like want to try it out. And then you start to do it over and over again, and you just kind of like hit a wall. And I mean, this happens often. There's so many people I know that like have just over empathized in their lives, and like whether that is out of obligation or not, like they've done it, and they just kind of feel like I don't want to empathize anymore. Like I'm done here. I need to focus on myself, and like that is I think the complete like right kind of like response here for that kind of moment in time. Hopefully, over more time, you find like a balance there, of course, but yeah, I mean it's something that we have to like think about, and if we're just like hyper focused on the idea of increasing empathy, we might accidentally lose sight of this other thing of that people might just burn out by having to do this too often. The last thing that I want to bring up is the samples that have been used for this kind of research. So, I mean, this is not one single research study that is here, but I have looked into some of the research studies that are looking into empathy, increasing empathy, and especially like through this more like app smartphone sort of way. And this is not to say that like this is inherently wrong or anything, right? But the samples that have been used are primarily white. And so what does race ethnicity have to do with this? I think it has to do a lot with this, especially when it's something that is interpersonal, such as empathy. And so in thinking about um, if the majority is trying to learn about empathy and trying to increase it, that's going to be different than somebody who is in the minority. And there's like those kind of things. There's also just like the other cultural differences between people of different race ethnicities. And so, I mean, some of the research that is out there is that in general, potentially Asians might empathize more often, but also in general, there's going to be less concern and more personal distress. And so, I mean, on its face, what does that actually mean? I don't know. But like, you can think about that and think about some of the reasons for why this empathy occurs. If it is more out of social obligation, more than just like my personal like motivation to do this, yeah, you might be more, you might be more distressed. You might also be less concerned. That is not to say that there isn't distress, even when it is a personal motivating kind of thing. And that's also not to say that like Asians as in general are just uncaring, unconcerned. That is absolutely not the case. But there is enough of a difference in research in the studies that have been shown for this that it does tend to be lower on concern and higher in distress. And so that is something we have to absolutely keep in mind, is like people aren't just people. People are people within a context, within an environment. And we have to know what that is, right? There's other things with empathy. One of the things that like my mind kind of goes to is this idea that, I mean, doctors can be very bad at empathizing. And I mean, yes, I'm harping on like one part of society, but it's a pretty huge, major, impactful part of society. And so, what comes to mind is this idea of medical racism, and that in general, Black people tend to be less empathized with, and that means that the things that they're saying are less heard. The things that they're trying to bring out to the table are just not being understood. The feelings that they actually have, the pain that they might have because of certain procedures, because of certain regimens, whatever it is. That is just not being communicated, or like it's not being respectfully understood, rather. And so, why am I saying this, right? I'm saying this because empathy is not just empathy. Empathy, again, like I kind of said this already, that empathy is, it's within a whole context of things. It is a whole social interaction, and you have to know the individual's backgrounds and the ways in which people have had to deal with empathy, and also the lack of empathy, unfortunately. Yeah, so I think that's kind of it. And I mean, I say that's it, but like also everything that I said, like they bring up so many other like points of concern potentially. There's also just like, I mean, within yourself, like, do you actually think that empathy is like a skill that we need to be increasing, regardless of all the other things that I'm saying? Like, it just inherently, is that something that we should be working toward? I personally think yes, but I think there's also so many other things that we need to be considering before we truly do that. And also to before we truly think that this works, because we can do this and maybe people on some sort of like sheet or like report or survey like say that they're more empathic, but like that doesn't actually lead to anything. So yeah, we need to I think further consider this, but it's probably going to happen at some point. And so hopefully you're that much more aware, having listened to this. So as always, I mean, I do want to also like hear your thoughts on any of this. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. That's also completely okay. But I'll leave that here for now. And I'll also say, like I said in the beginning, that there's more information on all this. If you want more specifics or anything like that, feel free to check out my other content, and you can learn more about this intervention. That's going to be on my website, which is roomforresearch.com, and then also on social media, which is @roomforresearch. And so until next time, thank you. Thank you for your time, and bye for now.
With the sun breeze.